Ale spilled across the tavern table, soaking into splintered oak. Alice didn't care. She was staring at the stranger in the corner, the one with scars like lightning strikes and eyes that swallowed the dim candlelight. 10 coppers says you won't leave a mark on him, Thomas slurred, slamming his mug down. It was a stupid dare, a fatal one really. But pride was a cruel master in winter, and Alice was broke. She wiped her mouth, stood up, and chose death. Poverty smelled like boiled cabbage and wet wool. It was a smell Alice knew intimately. She lived in it, breathed it, and right now she was about to die for it. The Boar's Head Tavern was a miserable place at the edge of the world. It sat squarely on the border between the civilized southern territories and the jagged, unforgiving northern peaks. Men who came here were usually running from something or marching toward an early grave. Tonight, the room was packed with the usual assortment of deserters, thieves, and merchants too cheap to pay for a room inside the city walls. And then there was him. He sat alone in the far corner, swallowed by the shadows, but taking up more space than any 3 men combined. He wore a heavy cloak of dark fur that looked entirely too expensive for this rotwood establishment. His boots were leather, thick and unaffected by the mud that coated the tavern floor. But it was his stillness that unnerved Alice. Drunks fidgeted, thieves twitched. This man sat with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a predator waiting for the wind to change. "You're not actually going to do it," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a raspy whisper. He leaned across the table, his breath foul with cheap ale and rotting teeth. Alice didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the stranger. "You said 10 coppers. I said it because you're a coward, Alice. Not because I thought you'd actually throw your life away." Thomas chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Look at him. He's northern. Probably a mercenary. He'd snap your neck before you even touched his tunic." 10 coppers buys a week of firewood," Alice said flatly. "It buys half a sack of flour. And it buys a new pair of boots so my toes don't freeze off when I walk to the tannery. It buys a coffin, more like." Thomas reached for his mug, but Alice slammed her hand down on the wood, trapping his wrist. "Put the coins on the table, Thomas. Now." Thomas blinked, his drunken haze parting just enough to see the sheer, feral desperation in her eyes. He swallowed hard. Fumbling in his greasy pouch, he pulled out 10 copper coins, dropping them one by one onto the stained wood. They clinked softly. It wasn't much money to anyone with a title or a trade. To Alice, it was survival. "You have to mark him," Thomas muttered, pulling his hand back as if the table had burned him. "A bruise, a scratch, somewhere everyone can see. Otherwise the bet is void." "Fine." Alice stood up. The tavern spun for a fraction of a second. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, but she locked her knees and steadied herself. She didn't feel brave. She wasn't a hero from the bard's songs. She was just cold, hungry, and entirely out of options. She walked across the room. Every step felt like wading through deep water. The tavern noise, the shouting, the lute playing, the clinking of tankards seemed to mute itself, reducing to a dull thrum in her ears. She focused on the stranger. He was nursing a single cup of dark liquid. He hadn't touched it in 10 minutes. As she drew closer, the scent of him hit her. It wasn't the smell of unwashed bodies, sour ale and despair that permeated the rest of the room. He smelled of pine needles, crushed ice, and cold iron. It was a clean scent. It was dangerous. Alice stopped at his table. He didn't look up. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his cloak, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw and a pale scar cutting across his neck. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. The stranger didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just kept staring at the wooden wall opposite him. Alice slid onto the bench next to him. Up close, His sheer size was suffocating. His shoulders blocked out the candlelight from the nearest sconce. She could feel the heat radiating off him in waves. "Not much of a talker, are you?" she murmured, leaning in. She needed to get close. She needed an excuse. "That's fine. Talk is cheap in this town anyway." Still nothing. The man was a statue carved from granite. Alice glanced back at her table. Thomas was watching, his mouth hanging open in a mix of horror and glee. He pointed a dirty finger at his own neck, pantomiming the dare. She turned back to the stranger. She had to do it now, before she lost her nerve. She shifted her weight, pretending to lose her balance in a drunken sway. She fell against his side. He felt like a brick wall. Her hand scrambled against his broad chest, grabbing the thick wool of his tunic to steady herself. He finally moved. His head turned slowly. Under the shadow of his hood, she saw a pair of eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. They weren't brown or blue. They were amber, cold, glowing amber, like whiskey held up to sunlight. There was no surprise in his gaze. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, ancient intelligence that made Alice feel like a rabbit caught in a snare. "Leave," he said. His voice was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated against her ribs. Alice swallowed the lump of terror in her throat. I lost my balance. Find it elsewhere." She should have listened. She should have stood up, walked back to Thomas, and admitted defeat. She would freeze this winter, but at least she would be alive. But Alice had spent her entire 22 years being pushed around. By landlords, by tannery masters, by drunken guards. She was so tired of being small. She leaned her face closer to his. She let her breath ghost across his jawline. "You're very rude, you know that?" she whispered, her lips barely a breath away from his skin. He didn't pull away. He simply watched her, his amber eyes tracking her every micro-expression. Alice opened her mouth, clamped her teeth down hard on the muscular ridge of his neck, and bit him. She bit down with everything she had, tasting salt, dirt, and the sudden, sharp tang of copper. She ground her teeth together, ensuring she left a mark, ensuring Thomas could see it from across the room. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then a growl ripped through the tavern. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a mountain crumbling, of ice cracking over a deep lake. It was a sound that bypassed logic and went straight into the primal fear center of the human brain. The lute player stopped mid-strum. A serving girl dropped a tray of tankards, the clay shattering against the floorboards. The boisterous noise of the tavern vanished in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, dead silence. Alice froze. Her teeth were still locked against the stranger's skin. She could feel the heavy, thudding rhythm of his pulse against her tongue. Slowly, terrified of what would happen if she moved, she released her grip and pulled back. There was a perfect crescent-shaped ring of red marks on his neck. A single drop of blood welled up from where one of her incisors had broken the skin, sliding slowly down his collarbone. She had marked him. She had won the 10 coppers. She was also completely, undeniably dead. The stranger reached up. He wiped the drop of blood with his thumb, then looked at it. His face was a mask of cold fury. He stood up. When he stood, the tavern seemed to shrink. He towered over Alice, a monolith of muscle and fur. His hood fell back, revealing thick, dark hair and sharp, aristocratic features marred by battle scars. But it wasn't his face that made 3 hardened mercenaries at the next table drop to their knees. It was the silver clasp fastening his heavy fur cloak. It was forged in the shape of a snarling wolf, its eyes inlaid with blood-red rubies. The crest of the Northern Crown. "Gods have mercy!" Someone whimpered in the back of the room. Alice couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt like they had collapsed. She recognized that crest. Everyone on the continent recognized that crest. It belonged to the Alpha King. Garrison Black, the man who had slaughtered the Eastern armies, the beast who tore out the throats of traitors with his own teeth. Garrison Black stared down at Alice. She was still sitting on the bench, her hands trembling violently in her lap. "Do you know what you just did, little human?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent tavern. Alice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She nodded, then shook her head. "By the old laws of the North," Garrison said slowly, his amber eyes burning into hers. "A bite is a claim. It is a challenge for dominance or a demand for mating." He tilted his head, studying her ragged dress, her pale, terrified face. "Tell me, street rat, which were you attempting?" "A dare," Alice whispered. It was all she could manage. "It was a dare." Garrison's gaze snapped up, scanning the room. "Who dared you?" Alice didn't want to answer. She was cynical, she was hard, but she wasn't a rat. She kept her mouth shut. She didn't need to speak. Garrison's senses were far beyond human. He caught the sharp, acrid scent of fresh urine coming from the other side of the room. Thomas had backed himself into a corner, his face devoid of color, a dark stain spreading across the front of his breeches. Before Alice could blink, two figures detached themselves from the darkest corners of the tavern. They moved with unnatural speed, completely silent. 1 second they were shadows, the next they were two massive men gripping Thomas by the arms. They threw him to the center of the floor, right at Garrison's feet. "My king," one of the men said, bowing his head. His eyes, too, held a faint golden glow. Wolf guards. They had been in the room the entire time. Thomas sobbed, pressing his forehead against the muddy floorboards. "Mercy, Your Grace. It was a joke, a stupid, drunken joke. I didn't know it was you. I swear on my mother's grave." Garrison didn't look at Thomas. He kept his eyes on Alice. "What was the wager?" 10 coppers, Alice said. Her voice was raspy, dry as cracked earth. Garrison finally looked down at Thomas. 10 coppers. You valued my pride and this woman's life at 10 coppers. "Please," Thomas begged, "take them. Take it all." He frantically shoved the coins across the floor. Garrison raised a boot and brought it down on Thomas's hand. The sickening crack of breaking bones echoed in the quiet room. Thomas shrieked, a high, reedy sound of absolute agony. "Pick them up," Garrison commanded the guard to his left. The guard scooped up the 10 copper coins. Garrison held out his hand, and the guard dropped them into his palm. Garrison turned back to Alice. He reached down, grabbing her by the chin with a grip that bruised bone. He hauled her to her feet. Alice gasped, grabbing his wrist, but she might as well have been trying to move a falling tree. He forced her hand open and pressed the 10 dirty copper coins into her palm, closing her fingers over them. "Your winnings," Garrison said softly. He let go of her chin. Alice stumbled back, clutching the coins to her chest. "Kill the worm," Garrison said over his shoulder, gesturing to Thomas. "Leave his head on the bar." "No!" Alice shouted. The word tore from her throat before she could stop it. Garrison paused. He turned back to her, his eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. The guard, who had drawn a curved hunting knife, froze in place. "You object?" Garrison asked. "He's an idiot," Alice breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's a drunken, pathetic idiot. But he doesn't deserve to die for a joke. I'm the one who bit you. If you need blood, take mine." Garrison studied her. He looked at her dirt-smudged cheeks, her frayed collar, her shaking hands. He stepped closer, crowding into her space until she was forced to lean back against the wooden pillar. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from hers. The smell of pine and iron enveloped her again. "You do not give me orders, little human," he whispered. "You claimed me. You broke my skin. By my laws, your life is forfeit to me. You belong to the crown now." He turned his head slightly, speaking to his guards. "Leave the fool. We ride north. Bind her to a horse." "Wait, what?" Alice stammered, panic finally breaking through her shock. "No, you can't just take me. I am the king of the north." Garrison interrupted, turning his back on her and striding toward the tavern door. "I can do whatever I please." The journey north was a masterclass in suffering. Alice had spent her life cold. She thought she knew winter. She was wrong. Southern winter was a mild inconvenience compared to the brutal, biting savagery of the northern winds. It felt like walking through shattered glass. They had been riding for 3 days. Alice was tied at the wrists to the pommel of a massive, ill-tempered grey gelding. She didn't have riding leathers or proper furs. She only had her thin woolen dress, a threadbare shawl, and the 10 copper coins securely tied in a rag inside her bodice. The irony was suffocating. She had the money to buy firewood, but she was going to freeze to death on the back of a horse. Garrison rode at the front of the small column. He hadn't spoken to her since they left the tavern. He barely spoke to his guards. He communicated in subtle hand gestures and low, guttural sounds that the other men seemed to understand perfectly. They were wolves? All of them. Alice had always thought the stories were exaggerated to keep children from wandering into the woods. She thought they were just feral men, mountain lords who were excessively hairy and violent. But over the last 3 days, she had seen them track prey by scent alone. She had seen one of the guards jump a 15-foot ravine from a standing position. They weren't human. By the 4th night, Alice was entirely numb. Her fingers were blue, her lips were cracked and bleeding. When the hunting party finally stopped to make camp in the shelter of a jagged cliff face, she didn't even have the strength to dismount. A guard had to haul her out of the saddle and dump her unceremoniously by the fire pit. She huddled into a tight ball, shivering so violently her teeth rattled. A heavy weight dropped over her shoulders. Alice flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, she was engulfed in suffocating warmth. It was a thick pelt, lined with dark fur. She looked up. Garrison was standing over her, looking down with an expression of mild annoyance. He was in his tunic, having just given her his own cloak. "If you freeze to death, I will look foolish for having spared you," he said flatly. Alice pulled the fur tighter around herself, burying her nose in the collar. It smelled overwhelmingly of him. "Why did you spare me?" she croaked. Her voice sounded like broken glass. Garrison sat on a large rock across the fire from her. He pulled a whetstone from his belt and began sharpening a dagger. The rhythmic ksh-ksh of the stone against steel was the only sound over the crackling flames. "I told you. You claimed a king. You are my property now." "I don't believe in property," Alice muttered, glaring at the fire. "I'm not a cow." Garrison paused his sharpening. A low, rumbling chuckle vibrated in his chest. It was a surprisingly pleasant sound. "You have teeth like a wolf, but the sense of a sheep. Why did you really do it? No human is foolish enough to assault a northern lord for 10 coppers. "I am," Alice said. She wasn't going to lie to him. What was the point? "I needed the money. The tannery master cut our wages. Half a loaf of bread costs 3 coppers now. Firewood costs 5. I was going to starve or freeze. The 10 coppers seemed worth the risk." Garrison stared at her. The amber in his eyes caught the firelight, making them look like liquid gold. "You risked execution for bread." "Nobles fight wars over pride," Alice shot back, finding a sliver of her usual cynical venom. "Kings burn down cities because they feel slighted. Is it really so crazy that a peasant would risk her life for food? At least my reason keeps me breathing." The guards around the camp went completely still. One of them actually took a step back, as if expecting Garrison to strike her down for her insolence. Garrison didn't strike her. He studied her, his gaze sweeping over her bruised face, her exhausted posture, the defiant tilt of her chin. "You are a strange creature, Alice Tanner," he said quietly. Alice blinked. "I never told you my name." "I heard the fool in the tavern say it." Garrison resumed sharpening his blade. "You will need that defiance where we are going. My court is not kind to humans. They will see you as a pet, or worse, a meal. If you show them weakness, they will tear you to ribbons." "Then let me go," Alice pleaded. "Drop me at the next village. I won't tell anyone what happened. You have your revenge. I've learned my lesson." Garrison sheathed his dagger with a sharp click. "No." "Why not?" "Because," Garrison said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory intensity. "When you bit me, you tasted my blood. You hold the scent of my mark in your lungs. My pack can smell it on you from 10 miles away. If I let you go, a rogue wolf will hunt you down within a day just to challenge my authority. You are safer by my side." Alice stared at him, the reality of her situation finally settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a walking target. She had tied herself to the most dangerous creature on the continent, all for a handful of copper. "Eat," Garrison commanded, tossing a piece of dried venison into her lap. "We reach the keep at dawn. You will need your strength to face the wolves." The rest of the night passed in miserable silence. Alice chewed the tough meat, her mind racing. Love and romance were fairy tales for girls with rich fathers. She didn't harbor any delusions that the Alpha King was keeping her out of some hidden affection. She was a political pawn, a scent marker in a dangerous game of pack dynamics. She was a peasant who had accidentally kicked a hornet's nest. When dawn finally broke, painting the harsh northern sky in shades of bruised purple and grey, they broke camp. An hour later, they crested a snowy ridge, and Alice saw it. Ironhold. It wasn't a castle. Castles were built by men. Ironhold looked like it had been violently ripped from the mountain itself. Massive, brutalist spires of black stone pierced the sky. The walls were jagged, unpolished rock, heavily fortified and completely devoid of banners or decoration. It was a fortress built for war, for survival, for beasts. As they rode down the winding path toward the massive iron gates, a sound drifted up from the valley below. It was a howl, then another joined it, and another, until the entire valley was echoing with a bone-chilling, harmonious symphony of wolves. They were announcing the return of their king. Garrison pulled his horse up beside Alice. He looked down at her pale, terrified face. "Welcome to your new home, little human," he said softly. "Try not to bleed." Iron gates groaned in protest as they swung inward, protesting the heavy frost that coated their hinges. Alice gripped the pommel of her saddle, her knuckles stark white against the grey morning light. Ironhold did not welcome guests. It swallowed them. The courtyard was a vast expanse of hard-packed earth and jagged stone, enclosed by towering walls that blocked out the pale sun. Dozens of figures moved through the space, but the atmosphere was entirely wrong. A southern keep was a chaotic mess of shouting merchants, braying livestock, and clattering armor. Ironhold was eerily, terrifyingly quiet. People did not walk, they prowled. Alice noticed the eyes first. As Garrison's horse stepped onto the frosted earth, every head in the courtyard turned in unison. There were men sharpening heavy axes near a forge, women carrying woven baskets of raw meat, and children wrestling in the snow. They all stopped. The children dropped their games, their small faces turning toward the king with unnatural stillness. Eyes of amber, pale green, and piercing yellow locked onto the arriving party. Garrison swung down from his massive black mount. He didn't offer a hand to help Alice. He simply stood beside her horse, a dark monolith waiting for her to move. Her legs felt like lead. She managed to swing one stiff leg over the saddle, but as her boots hit the frozen ground, her knees buckled. Alice braced herself for a harsh impact, but a hand clamped around her bicep, holding her upright with terrifying ease. Garrison's grip was unyielding. "Stand," he murmured, his voice barely carrying over the frigid wind. "If you fall now, they will never let you up." Alice gritted her teeth, forcing her frozen joints to lock. She pulled her arm from his grasp, wrapping the thick fur cloak tighter around her frail shoulders. "I'm standing. I just forgot how for a second." A low murmur rippled through the courtyard. It wasn't a whisper of gossip. It was a collective, vibrating growl. From the shadow of the main keep, a woman emerged. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, her heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the packed earth. She was tall, built like a longbow, with hair the color of dirty straw pulled back into a severe braid. Scars roped up the side of her neck, disappearing beneath a leather collar. "My king," the woman said. Her voice was velvet wrapped around a blade. "You return early, and you brought a stray." She stopped 3 paces from Garrison, but her pale green eyes were entirely fixed on Alice. The woman inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring. A look of profound confusion, followed instantly by raw disgust, contorted her sharp features. "Lyra," Garrison acknowledged, his tone flat, "is the perimeter secure?" "The eastern ridge is quiet. We found 3 poachers. We left their heads on pikes for the border guard to find." Lyra took a slow step closer to Alice. "She smells like poverty and stale ale. But beneath that—" Lyra's eyes snapped to Garrison. "She carries your scent deeply, and you carry a fresh scar." The courtyard went deathly still. Alice didn't flinch. She had dealt with Lyra's kind before. Oh, not werewolves, but the cruel, calculating foreman at the tannery who looked at Alice like a cockroach they couldn't wait to step on. Bullies all shared the same anatomy. They fed on fear. "I bite," Alice said flatly. Her voice rasped from the cold, but it didn't shake. Lyra's lip curled, revealing elongated, needle-sharp canines. "You are very brave for a creature with a neck so fragile. And you're very observant for someone who just realized water is wet." Alice shot back. "I'm freezing. Are we going to stand out here comparing teeth, or is there a fire inside?" A collective gasp echoed from the gathered crowd. Several of the guards shifted their weight, their hands drifting toward the heavy hilts of their swords. Lyra's eyes flashed a vibrant, glowing gold, her hands curling into claws at her sides. She lunged. It wasn't a step. It was a blur of motion. Alice didn't even have time to blink, let alone scream. But Lyra never reached her. Garrison didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply stepped sideways, interposing his massive frame between Alice and the attacking wolf. He released a sound from his chest, a deep, concussive snarl that rattled the loose stones on the courtyard walls. Lyra slammed to a halt, her boots digging trenches into the frosted earth. She immediately dropped her gaze, baring her neck in a gesture of total submission. Her chest heaved, but she didn't dare look up. "She is mine." Garrison's voice was a physical weight in the air, pressing down on everyone present. "She marked me. I accepted it. Anyone who touches her answers to my claws. Am I understood?" "Yes, my king," Lyra whispered to the dirt. Garrison turned his head slightly, peering over his heavy fur shoulder at Alice. "Inside, now." Alice didn't wait to be told twice. She marched past the kneeling Lyra, past the rows of stunned, golden-eyed monsters, and walked through the heavy oak doors of the keep. She kept her chin up and her back straight, exactly the way she used to walk past the drunken guards in her southern slum. Inside, Ironhold was just as bleak. The walls were naked, heavy blocks of dark stone. There were no tapestries to block the drafts, no woven rugs to warm the floors. The only light came from massive iron braziers roaring with pine logs, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like demons against the high, vaulted ceilings. Garrison caught up to her, grabbing her shoulder and steering her down a long, dimly lit corridor. "Are you insane?" he demanded softly, pushing her into a small, sparse room and shutting the heavy oak door behind them. "You told me not to show weakness," Alice countered, dropping her stolen fur cloak onto the narrow wooden cot that served as the room's only furniture. "I didn't. Lyra is my lead tracker. She has torn brown bears apart with her bare hands. You provoked her over a fire. She was trying to intimidate me," Alice said, walking over to the small hearth. The ashes were cold. She knelt, her hands instinctively reaching for a pile of kindling nearby. "If I let her do it, she'd never stop. That's how it works." Garrison watched her for a long moment. He leaned against the heavy oak door, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "You navigate my court like a street brawler." "I am a street brawler," Alice muttered, striking a flint against a steel striker she found on the mantel. A spark caught the dry moss. She blew on it gently, coaxing a tiny flame to life. "I just don't have the luxury of turning into a monster when I lose an argument." Warmth was a fragile, fleeting concept in the North. Alice sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the flames crackle in the small hearth. Her fingers were finally regaining their color, changing from a terrifying, bruised purple to a raw, stinging pink. The room Garrison had given her was a prison cell disguised as guest quarters. It had a bed with a lumpy straw mattress, a single wooden chair, and a barred window that looked out over a dizzying, vertical drop into a black ravine. There was no lock on the door, but Alice wasn't stupid. Escaping Ironhold meant walking into a frozen wasteland filled with predators that tracked by scent. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Alice didn't flinch. She had learned over the last hour that Garrison didn't knock. He stepped into the room, carrying a heavy wool tunic, a pair of thick leather breeches, and a pair of fur-lined boots. He tossed the bundle onto the cot. "Put those on," he ordered. "Your rags are an insult to the cold." "Thank you, Your Grace," Alice said, her tone dripping with heavy, unmistakable sarcasm. She didn't stand up. She just kept staring at the fire. Garrison didn't leave. He moved to the single wooden chair, pulling it closer to the hearth, and sat. For a massive man, he moved with zero wasted energy. He watched her, those unsettling amber eyes cataloguing every shiver, every exhausted blink. "You are angry?" he observed. Alice let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I am kidnapped. I am freezing. I am sitting in a fortress filled with literal monsters who want to eat me because I smell like poor life choices. Angry doesn't even begin to cover it." "You chose to bite a northern lord." "I needed 10 coppers to buy flour," Alice finally snapped, turning her head to glare at him. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be truly hungry? Not I missed supper hungry. The kind of hunger where your stomach acid eats its own lining and you start looking at boiled leather straps as a viable meal. I didn't care who you were. I just wanted to survive the week." Garrison's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, the golden hue shifting into a deep, burnt orange. "I know hunger, Alice Tanner. My people live on the edge of starvation every winter. The southern kings hoard the grain. They choke our trade routes. They look at us as rabid dogs, useful only when they need mercenaries to fight their border wars." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The firelight played across the brutal, jagged scar on his neck. "You think I kept you here out of cruelty?" Garrison continued, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating rumble that made Alice's ribs ache. "You think you are a prisoner of my pride?" "Aren't I?" "No." Garrison looked at the fire. "If a human drew my blood in a tavern and lived to tell the tale, my pack would see it as a fatal weakness. Alpha is not a title you inherit, little human. It is a title you hold by force. Every day, a younger, faster male is waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to show mercy." Alice frowned, her cynical armor cracking just a fraction. "So killing me would have proven your strength?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you?" Garrison went perfectly still. He turned his head slowly, locking his gaze with hers. The intensity in his eyes stripped the air from the small room. "Because when you lunged at me," Garrison said softly, "you didn't smell like fear. You smelled like desperation. You smelled like a cornered animal willing to tear its own leg off to escape a trap." He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers grazing the edge of her threadbare sleeve. "My pack respects ferocity. I brought you here to show them that I do not kill the desperate. I claim them. I weaponize them." Alice stared at his hand. The sheer size of his fingers made her feel incredibly fragile, like a glass ornament resting near a blacksmith's hammer. "I'm not a weapon," she whispered. "I sew torn tunics. I scrape fat off cowhides. I have nothing to offer a war camp. You stood before my lead enforcer and offered her your throat with a joke." Garrison countered. He pulled his hand back, standing up in one fluid motion. "You have spine, Alice. That is rarer than silver in this world. Wear the clothes. Food will be brought shortly." He turned and walked toward the door. "Wait," Alice called out. Garrison paused, his hand on the heavy iron latch. "The dare," Alice said, swallowing hard. "Thomas said a bite is a claim, a demand for dominance, or a demand for mating." She forced herself to look at his broad back. "Which one do they think this is?" Garrison looked over his shoulder. A cruel, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You bit an alpha king, Alice. A demand for dominance would mean you intend to kill me and lead the armies of the North." His eyes flicked down her small, shivering frame. "They know you cannot kill me." He opened the door and stepped out into the freezing corridor. "So I suggest you lock your door at night, little human," Garrison murmured, right before he pulled the heavy oak shut. "Lest they think you are eager to fulfill the alternative." The heavy thud of the closing door echoed like a gunshot. Alice sat perfectly still, staring at the scarred wood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She slowly stood up, walked over to the cot, and grabbed the heavy iron chair, wedging it firmly under the door handle. Morning arrived without warmth. Alice stared at the frosted breath leaving her lips, counting the seconds before the white vapor dissipated into the freezing air of her cell. Survival meant adaptation. She swung her legs over the cot, dragging the thick woolen tunic over her head and pulling on the heavy leather breeches. They were too large, meant for a young male, perhaps, but they trapped her body heat. She laced the fur-lined boots tight. They felt like armor. She removed the heavy iron chair from under the door handle. Hiding in a room was a luxury for the rich. Alice belonged to the working class, and the working class earned their right to exist by making themselves useful. She stepped out into the corridor. Torches crackled, casting long, erratic shadows across the naked stone. She followed the scent of roasting meat and wood smoke, navigating the labyrinth of ironhold until she found the great hall. It was massive, a cavernous space filled with long oak tables and hundreds of northern wolves breaking their fast. Silence crashed down the moment her boots hit the threshold. Hundreds of glowing eyes snapped to her. Forks stopped midway to mouths, the primal, suffocating weight of an apex predator pack assessing a prey animal filled the room. Alice kept her chin level. She did not look at the floor. She walked toward the nearest table, zeroing in on an older woman with iron-gray hair who was aggressively kneading a massive trough of dough. Next to the woman sat a pile of unpeeled winter roots and a small, neglected paring knife. Alice slid onto the bench beside the gray-haired wolf. She picked up the knife. "I peel, you bake." Alice asked, her voice steady. The old woman stopped kneading. She stared at Alice, then at the knife, and then let out a sharp, barking laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. You have nerve, little human. Peel, thin skins. I hate chewing on dirt. Alice set to work. The rhythm of the blade against the tough roots was familiar. It grounded her. Around her, the great hall slowly resumed its chaotic noise, though she felt the heavy gaze of a dozen wolves tracking her every movement. They think you belong in his bed, the old woman muttered, slamming a heavy fist into the dough. They smell his mark on you, but you smell like wet copper and fear, not a rutting mate. I belong to myself, Alice said, keeping her eyes on her task. The mark was a mistake, a tavern bet. Kings do not make mistakes. The woman snorted. And Garrison Black certainly does not bring human women across the frost line for a joke. I am Maeve. Keep your head down, Alice Tanner, and you might keep it attached to your neck. An hour passed. Alice peeled until her fingers ached. Then the temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a draft. It was a physical manifestation of power. Alice looked up as Garrison entered the hall. He wore dark leathers today, a broadsword strapped across his wide back. He didn't strut. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his amber eyes sweeping the room before locking onto Alice. He altered his path, walking directly toward the kitchens. The wolves at the tables leaned back, giving him a wide berth, baring their necks in silent submission. Garrison stopped behind Alice. He looked down at the massive pile of peeled roots, then at the small paring knife in her hand. You are a guest, not a scullery maid, he said softly. I'm a captive, Alice corrected, tossing a skinned root into the boiling pot nearby. And captives who don't work get eaten. I prefer to be useful. A tiny muscle feathered in Garrison's jaw. He reached down, his large hand wrapping around her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the sheer heat radiating from his skin made Alice's breath hitch. He pulled her gently but firmly away from the table. You eat with me, he commanded. I'm filthy, she protested, wiping dirt on her breeches. You are alive. That is enough. He led her to the raised dais at the far end of the hall. A heavy oak table sat apart from the rest, draped in dark furs. Garrison pushed her into a chair to his right, taking the large, high-backed seat at the center. Plates of roasted venison, thick brown bread, and sharp mountain cheese were slammed down in front of them by silent servants. Sitting up here meant she could see everyone, but it also meant everyone could see her. Lyra sat at a nearby table, her pale green eyes burning holes into Alice's skull. A few seats down from Lyra was a massive, scarred male with hair the color of rusted iron. He was glaring at Garrison, his lip curled just enough to show an elongated canine. Who is that? Alice murmured, tearing off a piece of bread. Kyle. Garrison replied without looking up from his meat. My second in command, and currently my biggest headache. He looks like he wants to mount your head on a pike. Garrison let out a low rumble of amusement. He does. He thinks I am becoming soft. Bringing a fragile human into the stronghold during winter is a provocation. It tells the pack I care so little for their traditions that I will flaunt a weak creature in their faces. Alice swallowed dryly. Then why do it? Why force me to sit up here? You're just giving him a reason to challenge you. Garrison finally turned his head, his amber eyes pinning her in place. Because if I hide you in a cell, you are prey. If I put you by my side, you are a queen. And they do not touch queens. Alice's heart did a strange, painful flutter. She forcefully shoved the feeling down. I'm not a queen. I'm a tanner from a slum. You are what I say you are, Garrison whispered, leaning closer. The scent of pine and cold iron wrapped around her. Play the part, Alice. or Kyle will tear your throat out the moment I turn my back." Night fell over Ironhold like a suffocating blanket. The wind howled against the stone walls, a feral shriek that made the heavy iron braziers flicker and smoke. Alice hated the great hall at night. The drinking started, and when wolves drank, their human masks slipped. Claws tapped nervously against oak tables. Growls replaced laughter. The air grew thick with musky, aggressive pheromones that made Alice's stomach churn. She sat next to Garrison on the dais, pushing a piece of tough meat around her wooden plate. Garrison was engaged in a low, tense conversation with two of his scouts, his massive shoulders hunched over a parchment map. Alice reached for her heavy iron cup, intending to take a sip of the bitter northern ale. Before her fingers brushed the metal, a massive hand slammed down on the table, violently shattering her wooden plate. Splinters flew into her face, and Alice flinched backward, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. Kyle stood over her. He was drunk, and he was massive. Up close, the rusted iron color of his hair was matted with sweat. His eyes were fully shifted, bright, glowing yellow. His chest heaved, radiating an aggressive, suffocating heat. "Oops." Kyle slurred, a cruel, jagged smile stretching across his face. "Pardon my clumsiness, little pet." The great hall went dead silent. The lute player in the corner stopped abruptly. Garrison's conversation with the scouts ceased. Alice stared at the ruined plate, a sharp spike of pure adrenaline flooding her system. She didn't look at Garrison. She knew how this worked. In the slums, if someone cornered you and you waited for the guard to save you, you died. You had to save yourself. "You owe me a plate," Alice said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Kyle laughed, a barking, grating sound. He leaned over the table, crowding her space, his hot, sour breath washing over her face. "I owe you nothing, human. You sit in our hall, eating our meat, reeking of weakness. He may find your pathetic scent amusing, but I find it sickening. You are a stain on this pack." Kyle reached out, his thick fingers hooking into the collar of Alice's woolen tunic. He meant to haul her over the table. Alice didn't hesitate. She didn't try to pull away. She grabbed her heavy iron cup, filled to the brim with scalding, spiced ale from the fire, and smashed it directly upward into Kyle's jaw. The heavy iron connected with a sickening crunch. Hot ale splashed across Kyle's face and eyes. Kyle roared, stumbling backward, his hands flying to his burned, bruised face. Before he could recover, before he could lunge at her and rip her limb from limb, a shadow descended. Garrison vaulted the heavy oak table in a single, fluid motion. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't need to. He slammed into Kale with the force of a falling boulder. The two massive men hit the stone floor, shaking the very foundations of the hall. Kyle recovered fast, his claws extending, tearing a massive gash across Garrison's leather tunic. But Garrison was the alpha for a reason. He caught Kyle's throat in one massive hand, hoisting the heavier man entirely off the ground. Garrison's eyes weren't amber anymore. They were liquid fire. His canines elongated, dropping past his lower lip. "Challenge me!" Garrison roared, his voice shaking the stone from the rafters. "Do it, Kale. Bare your teeth and fight me for the crown. But if you touch her again, I will not wait for a challenge. I will pull your spine out through your throat." Kyle gagged, his legs kicking wildly in the air. For a long, agonizing moment he clawed at Garrison's arm, his yellow eyes burning with defiant rage. But slowly, the sheer, oppressive weight of Garrison's aura forced Kale's will to break. Kyle went limp, pulling his claws back, exposing his neck as best he could while being choked. Garrison threw him. Kyle slammed into a stone pillar 10 feet away, crumpling to the floor in a coughing, wheezing heap. Garrison stood in the center of the hall, his chest heaving, his claws slowly retracting. He swept his burning gaze across the silent room. "She is mine!" Garrison snarled to the entire pack. "Her enemies are my enemies! Her disrespect is my disrespect. Any wolf who forgets this will answer to my teeth." No one moved. No one breathed. Garrison turned, walking slowly back to the dais. He stepped over the ruined table, his eyes locking on to Alice. The feral fire in his gaze slowly cooled back down to a smouldering amber. Alice was still standing, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of her chair. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. She had a small cut on her cheek where a splinter from the plate had grazed her, a tiny crimson bead welling up on her pale skin. Garrison stopped in front of her. He reached out, his massive, calloused thumb gently wiping the red drop from her cheek. The contrast between the horrific violence he had just committed and the infinite gentleness of his touch made Alice's head spin. "You broke his jaw," Garrison murmured, a faint trace of awe in his deep voice. "He was ruining my dinner," Alice croaked, trying to sound cynical, but her voice betrayed a heavy tremble. Garrison's hand drifted down, cupping the side of her neck, his thumb resting directly over the erratic, racing pulse at her throat. He could feel her terror, but he could also feel her undeniable grit. "I told you," Garrison whispered, stepping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You have teeth, Alice Tanner. Come." He didn't order her back to her cold cell. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip warm and absolute, and led her out of the great hall, toward the highest tower in the keep, toward his own chambers. The joke was over. The claim was real, and Alice was terrifyingly aware that she didn't want to run away anymore. Heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing the chaotic noise of the great hall. Garrison's chambers were not what Alice expected. There were no skulls on spikes, no barbaric trophies mounted to the stone. It was a massive, circular room lined with towering bookshelves and heavy scrolls. A colossal hearth dominated the far wall, radiating a dry, intense heat that finally stopped the shivering deep in Alice's bones. The bed was a sprawling platform of carved pine, draped generously in thick, dark pelts. Alice stood near the center of the room, her hands hovering awkwardly at her sides. She was acutely aware of the mud caked on her boots and the dried ale staining her woolen sleeve. She didn't belong here. She belonged in the muddy alleys of the South, freezing her fingers off at the tanning vats, while men like Thomas threw coppers at her feet. Garrison walked past her, rolling his massive shoulders. He unbuckled his sword belt, tossing it onto a heavy chest, and then stripped off his ruined leather tunic. His back was a complex map of violence. Thick, pale scars crisscrossed over tightly coiled muscle, souvenirs of 100 brutal challenges. The fresh gash Kyle had left on his shoulder was already clotting, the edges knitting together with unnatural, terrifying speed. "You should sit," Garrison said, not turning around as he poured dark amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 heavy glass cups. "Your knees are shaking." "I just smashed a heavy iron cup into a werewolf's face," Alice replied, her voice remarkably level, despite the adrenaline crash making her stomach churn. "I think I'm allowed to have shaky knees." Garrison chuckled, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to hum in the floorboards. He turned and offered her one of the glasses. Alice took it, ensuring her fingers didn't brush his. She downed the liquid in one swift, punishing gulp. It burned like liquid fire going down, settling in her stomach with a heavy, spreading warmth. She coughed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Are you going to make me sleep on the floor?" she asked, eyeing the massive bed. She needed to know the rules of this new cage. "I do not make my equals sleep on the floor," Garrison said simply, taking a slow sip from his own glass. "Stop doing that!" Alice snapped. The alcohol was loosening her tongue, peeling back the layers of cynical self-preservation she had built up over 22 years. I'm a joke to them. A prop to keep your second-in-command from slitting your throat in your sleep. I'm a peasant who made a stupid bet because she was starving. Don't dress it up in royal titles." Garrison set his glass down on the mantel. He moved toward her, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the woven rugs. He stopped inches away, towering over her. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders. His calluses were rough against her tunic. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a roar, but it held the absolute weight of a king. Alice looked up. His amber eyes were entirely human right now. There was no glowing fire, no feral predator demanding submission. Just a deeply exhausted man holding the weight of a violent, unforgiving world on his shoulders. "When you bit me," Garrison said, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone over the wool, "you claimed me. The pack smelled it. They saw the blood. But do you know what else happens when a mate is claimed in the north?" Alice shook her head, her breath hitching despite her best efforts to remain stoic. "The claim goes both ways," Garrison whispered. "My wolf recognized you. He felt your desperation, your pure, unfiltered defiance. He decided in that rotting tavern that you belonged to him. If I had left you there with 10 coppers and a bruised neck, I would have torn myself apart from the inside out. I didn't bring you here as a prop, Alice. I brought you here because I physically could not leave you behind." Alice stared at him. The cynicism she wore like rusted armor suddenly felt incredibly heavy, suffocating. She had spent her entire life expecting the worst from people, because people had only ever given her their absolute worst. But Garrison was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a crumbling, chaotic world. "I'm human," Alice argued weakly, her voice cracking. "I get sick. I age faster than you. I can't run in the snow or hunt stags with my bare hands. I have nothing to offer a pack of predators. I have an entire army of wolves who can hunt." Garrison replied, stepping closer, closing the final inch of distance between them until her chest brushed against his bare stomach. "I don't need another killer. I need a mind that understands how the world works. I need someone who looks at a monster and refuses to flinch." He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, his nose grazing her erratic pulse point. Alice closed her eyes, her hands instinctively coming up to rest flat against his scarred chest. She could feel the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart beneath her palms. "You belong here," Garrison murmured against her skin, his breath sending a jolt of heat straight down her spine. "With me." Alice didn't pull away. She leaned into him, letting the overwhelming warmth of his massive frame envelop her entirely. She was so incredibly tired of fighting. She was tired of being cold. For the first time in her life, she let herself be held. Winter eventually broke, surrendering to a harsh, muddy spring. But the political frost within Ironhold thawed much faster. Alice did not become a wolf, but she learned to lead them. She realized quickly that a pack ran on logistics just as much as it ran on blood and dominance. The North was starving because Southern merchants choked their supply lines, treating the wolves like rabid animals to be quarantined. Alice knew Southern merchants. She knew their greed, their loopholes, and their cowardice. Within 2 months, she had overhauled Ironhold's trade agreements. She drafted aggressive, ironclad contracts that threatened to cut off the South's supply of northern iron and furs unless the grain shipments tripled. She sat at the head of the great oak table, Garrison standing silently behind her chair, and negotiated with terrified human emissaries who couldn't look past her scars and the massive beasts flanking her. She secured enough food to feed the entire territory for 3 winters. She earned her crown not with claws, but with a quill and a ruthless, cynical intellect. The true test, however, came on the first day of the spring thaw. The great courtyard was entirely packed with wolves. The mud was thick, clinging to heavy boots and bare feet alike. Alice stood on the stone steps of the keep, wearing a heavy cloak of deep crimson wool, the silver wolf crest of the Alpha King pinned securely over her heart. Garrison stood beside her, his presence a dark, immovable storm. Cale stepped forward from the crowd. His jaw had healed, though it sat slightly crooked now, giving his permanent scowl a lopsided, brutal quality. He walked to the base of the stairs and stopped. The entire courtyard had held its collective breath. Challenges for the Alpha position usually happened in the spring. Kyle looked up at Garrison, his yellow eyes flashing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he shifted his gaze to Alice. Alice didn't flinch. She met his stare with flat, unwavering calm. She didn't have claws, but she held the lives of his people in her ledgers. She had fed his pups. She had secured their borders. Kyle let out a long, heavy breath that plumed in the crisp morning air. He dropped to one knee, splashing heavy mud onto his leather breeches. He bowed his head, exposing his thick, scarred neck. "My king," Cale rumbled. Then he tilted his head slightly toward Alice. "My queen, the eastern ridge is clear. We await your orders." A deafening howl erupted from the gathered pack. It wasn't a challenge, it was a cheer. A brutal, harmonious symphony of acceptance that echoed off the jagged mountains and shook the remaining snow from the pine branches. Alice felt Garrison's large hand wrap around hers, his fingers lacing tightly with her own. She looked up at him. He was already looking down at her, a rare, genuine smile softening the harsh lines of his face. Later that night, the great hall was empty, save for the roaring fire and the two of them. Alice sat on the thick fur rug in front of the hearth, leaning back against Garrison's chest. His arms were wrapped around her waist, his chin resting comfortably on top of her head. The silence was comfortable, heavy with unspoken permanence. Alice reached into the deep pocket of her woolen dress. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She pulled out a small, tied rag and opened it, letting 10 dull copper coins spill into the palm of her hand. Garrison shifted behind her, looking down at the coins. "You kept them." "Of course I kept them," Alice said, running a thumb over the tarnished face of a southern king, stamped on the metal. "They are the most expensive things I own. They bought me an entire kingdom." Garrison let out a low rumble of amusement. He reached around her, his large fingers plucking one of the small coins from her palm. He held it up to the firelight, studying it with a critical eye. "Thomas Reed was a fool," Garrison murmured, tossing the coin back into her hand and wrapping his arms tighter around her. "He drastically undervalued you. I would have let you bite me for free." Alice laughed, tilting her head back to press a kiss to the jagged scar on his neck. "Don't get soft on me now, Your Grace. We have a kingdom to run." Garrison smiled against her skin, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight. "Yes, my queen. If you loved witnessing Alice rise from a starving outcast to the ruthless Queen of the North, smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Her journey proves that true power doesn't always require sharp claws. Sometimes, all you need is an iron will and the courage to bite back. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic, dark fantasy romance. Let us know in the comments what you think Alice will conquer next. Join our pack today and keep the stories alive.